Let me tell you a story about a group of protesters who broke into an RAF base and attempted to disable two US B-52 bombers to prevent them from being used in an illegal war. The protesters were arrested and were subsequently defended by a team of human rights lawyers who successfully argued their actions were a form of non-violent direct action intended to prevent war crimes. Now sadly, I am not talking about members of Palestine Action, who currently have 33 members of the group held on remand in UK prisons, 5 of whom are being held for breaking into RAF Brize Norton and dousing a UK spy plane used in support of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza in red paint, a crime that prior to their designation as a terrorist group would have been classified as minor criminal damage. No, this case in 2003 was in response to the US's illegal invasion of Iraq, and in a cruel twist of irony for the protesters currently being held for their crimes of conscience, after being compelled by their sense of what is morally just, choosing to take direct action against an Israeli military campaign in Gaza that has, by all agreed international standards, long ago crossed the line from a proportionate response to the Hamas October 7th attacks into a campaign largely defined by war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. This case was successfully defended by a group of human rights lawyers who included the current Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and became a landmark case for the use of conscience as a legal defence. Starmer, who is now the figurehead of a government that has chosen, in the Commons earlier this year, to designate Palestine Action, a group protesting genocide, as a terrorist organisation, via a gross overreach in the definition of the term violent during the Commons procedures, which, if you look back, was key to their designation and largely driven by the doxing of British employees at the British-based sites of Israeli defence company Elbit Systems. Look, threats to share personal information online are a very common form of direct action in the information age. However, the drive towards designation was undoubtedly a politically motivated decision to protect our alliance with Israel and our shared arms-producing interests over our government's legal duty to uphold international law. Both this Labour government and the previous Tory regime choosing complicity over international law. As such, it's also cruelly ironic that as the 8 members of Palestine Action bravely endure hunger strikes inside British prisons today, whose lawyers are poised to take the government to the High Court this afternoon over its alleged failure to provide the legally bound care afforded to prisoners during hunger strikes, and make a call for intervention on human rights grounds, that the Minister for Prisons, Lord Timpson, alongside Justice Secretary David Lammy, have refused to meet with the protesters on the basis that there is a separation of powers and that an independent judiciary is a cornerstone of that. As these protesters would not have been held on remand today if it was not for the decision in the Commons to wrongfully designate the group under the 2000 Terrorism Act, particularly given both this Labour and the previous Tory government's ties to the pro-Israeli lobby in the UK and their hugely influential role in guiding UK policy before and since the genocide began. And just this week, Israel's far-right government's campaign of ethnic cleansing continues with the approval of 19 more illegal settlements in the West Bank. Support for Palestine Action has since seen one of the largest campaigns of civil disobedience in modern British history, with over 2,700 people arrested for displaying banners in support of the group. Most recently today, including social justice warrior Greta Thunberg outside Aspen Insurance in London, the insurers of Elbit Systems. The fact is that there are hugely concerning examples of the government's use of, in this case, the Terrorism Act, and previously, under the Tories, the use of new legislation to enact a campaign of suppression over British citizens' right to protest, which has seen good, honest, brave, politically active people tied up in our justice system. And in the cases of both anti-genocide and anti-fossil fuel protesters, lost their freedom, serving lengthy jail sentences for daring to breach the increasingly narrow definition of state-approved protest. However, this is where the case against government overreach towards legitimate peaceful protest and the current dire state of the right to protest in this country begins to potentially project a frightening future for civil liberties and human rights in this country, particularly in an age where the likes of Palantir and Chinese social credit surveillance already exists, where one day, when people may have to stand up to defend our democratic values against the liberal forces of authoritarianism, totalitarianism and tyranny that we find over the preceding years and decades, successive governments had eroded these vital tools in civilian engagement in our politic and provided a future, hopefully theoretical but far from impossible in this current age, far-right anti-democratic regime in the UK with the tools to clamp down on resistance. A phenomenon we are sadly witnessing, despite their proud history of revolution, in the United States under the Trumpian far-right authoritarian model. And we do in fact have a Trump tribute act here in the form of Farage and his own brand of far-right anti-immigrant, pro-austerity, big business and high finance, deport the marginalised and most vulnerable in place of social and economic justice politics, waiting in the wings to bring Trumpism to these shores. The fact is, the government's designation of Palestine action and previous government's potential wider untold misuse of the 2000 Terrorism Act, coupled with the Tories' legislative clampdown on climate activism, is not only unjust to its core, it critically undermines the future of democracy in this country. And it speaks volumes of the role of vested interests that, while honest protesters are criminalised, fossil fuel companies still raking huge profits, and useful idiots like Tommy Ten Names and his wider cohort of far-right agitators are allowed to congregate en masse, even after the violent Islamophobic riots last summer, even hosting some of the worst architects of this global push, funded by the super-rich, to stoke anti-immigrant sentiment to protect their profits, like Elon Musk, via video link where the world's richest man repeated his characteristic extreme right rhetoric, telling the far-right Unite the Kingdom rally earlier this year that, quote, whether you choose violence or not, violence is coming to you. You either fight back or you die. Musk having previously used his social media platform to stoke outrageously far-fetched fears that England was on the brink of civil war, unlike the reality where a fairly small band of former football hooligans have been radicalised online by a mix of far-right pro-elite wealth agitators, Zionists and Russian information warfare professional trolls. The fact that Musk owns these trolls' most valuable platform, X, and also huge multinational companies who benefit from the working class being distracted by inflated fears of immigration and away from calls for a reining in the global multinationals' power, their tax dodging and unchecked billionaire wealth and power is not a coincidence. The fact that the new head of MI6 just last week warned against the ongoing transfer of power from governments and their people to global tech giants and their owners again hits home that the threat to our freedoms a global techno-feudal regime poses to our democratic values, civil liberties and human rights is happening now. The fact that the US spy tech company Palantir is in the process of strengthening its commercial ties to the NHS and not only our private data, despite the fact they are owned by Peter Thiel, who has openly professed his belief that democracy should be subverted in the name of technological advances, while his company currently use their tech in the States to help direct Trump's Gestapo-like ICE terrorising the humanic community, while Trump concurrently enacts his brand of austerity, dismantling the federal government and overseeing the biggest transfer of wealth from state to private wealth in human history via his tax cuts for the 1% that are to be funded with US national debt to the tune of trillions of dollars, shows you how close we are to the totalitarian techno-tyranny that one day we may be unable to take to the streets against in the UK, given the framework for suppression of the right to protest our current laws provide any future far-right aligned government. Meaning where we are is government's clampdowns on protest today creates a precedent for the suppression of legitimate protest in the future, which say under a Trumpian, anti-democratic, grossly illiberal reform government would be turned on legitimate protest. Protest that could very well be in defence of rights earned last century, the democratic advances of the 1800s, even going all the way back to the rights established in Magna Carta, and an undoing of the very foundation of civil society in these four nations if this is allowed to happen. Protest may be our last line of defence, and much like all forms of oppression, will be the most vulnerable voiceless members of society who already are situated on the margins, outside of the established parameters of power, who will suffer the most: the disabled, immigrants, and those on the lowest incomes and in the poorest regions. We can only hope that a future where an authoritarian, anti-immigrant, pro-elite reform government, enacting draconian austerity and mass privatisation of the state, with a smokescreen of mass deportations to appease the propagandised minds of the working class, as we have seen in the past 12 months in the States, is not the lesson needed for ordinary would-be reform voters today that the distinction between immigrant and working class does not exist in the eyes of the super wealthy, big business and their paid political mouthpieces. A unity that will be discovered too late, when all, including our right to mobilise against neo-fascist policy, is lost. That can happen here as it is currently happening to our cousins across the pond today. But that is only part of the picture. While defending our rights, and as a result the rights of free people across the world, in the face of a growing authoritarian lurch to the right, we must also learn from the lessons of the past and be proactive in remedying the issues the world faces that are rooted in decisions made in an era in the past when the British Empire was the world's leading and at times only global superpower. As British support for Zionism is simply a legacy of a strategic decision made at the height of World War I, in view of rallying both Russian and American Jewish communities, and creating a pro-British ballast in the Arab world, and crucially maintaining control over the Suez Canal. Formalised in the 1917 Balfour Declaration, Britain declared their support for a Jewish state in their ancient homeland. However, crucially stated that, quote, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Put in more black and white, or should I say black and tan terms, by the British military governor of Jerusalem at the time, Sir Ronald Sors, the objective was to create, quote, for England, a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. And over the preceding century, our ironclad political, military and intelligence ties to Israel, as well as the hugely influential pro-Zionist lobby in this country, is in a long way explained by the origin story of the creation of the state itself. And that is why we must take a moral responsibility as far as our state is able against the crimes that Israel continues to commit on its Palestinian captives. From illegal West Bank settlements to the genocide, the apartheid-style realities of life within Palestine, to their continued efforts to block the creation of a free sovereign Palestinian state, to Israel's systematic conflation between the religion and ethnic global Jewish community with the crimes of far-right Zionist politicians within Israel itself, where criticising their government's policies is akin to anti-Semitism, a gross manipulation on the genuine oppression Jewish people continue to face in the world today, with the violent anti-Arab policies of a state to which the majority of Jews are not residents. We remain needlessly handcuffed to the Israeli far right. After all, the modern Arab world are essentially now also British, European and Western allies. In the end, good protesters should not face the full power of the state. It is the power of independent inquiry and government's power to direct new foreign policy that should now be the focus and take precedent. Our unrestricted backing of anything Israel does, no matter how far they go, must now be scrutinised and dismantled to ensure that government elected by the British people is never again complicit in the barbarous crimes of far-right politicians within the Israeli state. We in fact have a moral obligation to support the creation of a Palestinian state and to ensure Israel adheres to international law and within that honour the legal boundaries of a future Palestinian state. Much like your party under Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn and now under its vast membership have been advocating, we must demand a public inquiry into our role in this criminal campaign of state-sponsored terrorism Israel has enacted against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, but also full transparency on the extent of both Israeli diplomatic but also domestic lobbyists in shaping our terribly misguided policy towards this genocidal campaign and in the broader conduct of Israel over the past half-century. So in other words, as well as freeing Palestine Action and reversing the years of draconian legislation to keep free our inalienable right to free expression and protest, we must ensure first and foremost our government's foreign policy to the region is to free Palestine and the Palestinian people from a century of oppression for which we are the architects.